Good evening and welcome to Glasgow Loves the EU. This evening we're joined by Ximena Vengoechea. Ximena is a Scottish advocate, dual qualified lawyer, specialist in human rights and international humanitarian law. She achieved an MA in politics, specialising in peace studies. Her practice areas are crime, asylum and discrimination. So welcome, Ximena. And we're also great. And we're also joined by Paul, who'll be taking your questions on social media. So if you have any questions, just pop them onto Facebook or Twitter. And we've got Bernd who's helping us with the IT. So first of all, Ximena, can you tell us about your career so far and how you ended up in Edinburgh? Oh, you're on mute.
Keeps happening, so sorry. Right, yeah, it's a long journey, or should I say a long swim, because I'm coming all the way from Colombia, right? So basically, well, geez, I grew up in a country at war, a country that has lived internal armed conflict for decades, right? And I was always very interested in, obviously, in getting, I was always very interested in you know, violence, the issues of why people fight, what are the causes of violence, how do we respond to that. I grew up in a very intellectual, politically aware family. Debate was kind of daily bread, really, much discussion. And yeah, I decided I wanted to law. And when I started, I wanted to do something that would, I don't know, that it really infused me to think that I could do something that I could apply anywhere in the world. And so I went for human rights. Then I worked for, well, it's like it's the government, but it's not, Procuraduría General. And I did a constitutional analysis of criminal law, criminal policy, and also, what else did we do? The treaties, we had to review them and make sure they were compatible with the new Colombian constitution that was adopted in 1991. By this time, it was 1994, I was 23. And yeah, I thought I could change the world. Anyway, I then moved on to becoming, we used to participate in a constitutional control of laws, which is a judicial process. And basically the Colombian constitution had the beautiful thing that in one of its first articles, it incorporated all the human rights treaties and conventions and instruments that Colombia was a signatory to. So it made them part of the constitution as soon as, and Colombia has a civilian system of law, so we operate German concept of the Grundnorm. You will forgive my German pronunciation, which is non-existent. And basically, it was making sure that everything that emanates from the state, every decision from parliament, from the executive and judicial decisions are consistent with the constitution and through it with the international human rights system. Then I started investigating crimes committed by the armed forces. I'm moving to something called the Elite Unit for Human Rights Investigations. All human rights workers, defenders became military targets for irregular armed groups, and there's a lot of corruption as well. You then kind of start questioning, can I do this somewhere else? Can I help people somewhere else? And I left the country. I did get a scholarship, decided I didn't want to do anything to do with law, did a master's in peace studies, and then came back to law. I did work with communities, work with children, thinking how to work in prevention of violence. When I was investigating crimes, I was thinking, right, there's been a massacre, and here I am with my technician, they're collecting the teeth of the people that have been massacred, people that were at a party by paramilitary groups with the acquiescence of the army. And how did we get to the stage, and what can we do to go back to it? There was a project some psychopedagogic. There's such a specialty in Colombia, as we have violentologists as well. These ladies had a beautiful program in a war zone, trying to bring together the children, regardless of the political affiliation or combatant or no status of regular or irregular combatant status of the parents, and through play and through allowing the children that space to be together, trying to build peace. This was 30 years ago. And from that, when I did my master's, I started working on the idea of peace. How do we build peace? I became a mother, tried to combine that with what I had learned. I wanted to put into practice, work with various communities. I use dance, I use play, I use art. I had done some work with the young people in deprived areas in Colombia where there was gang violence in the past. And and then at some point I decided that I had to get back to law, became an intern to the faculty of the Scottish Bar, then studied Scottish law, and here I am, 9 years later after my calling day, and trying to do as much work that is compatible or tries to promote and take forward the idea of human rights are here, human rights are for all, and try to combat the perception that has been very prevalent and sponsored by the media that human rights are, kind of an idea that will only benefit prisoners and refugees and that kind of thing.
Because obviously, you have human rights no matter where you are, who you are, even if you're just sitting at home watching TV, you have human rights. Yeah. And so we're here this evening then to talk about the issues obviously in Ukraine and the situation there. And we're hearing a lot of reports of, human rights abuses and, war crimes happening there. Can you just explain exactly what war crimes are for the audience? And then if you could just explain briefly the origin and the history of war crimes legislation.
Right. So, war crimes, technically as a concept, is a relatively modern notion, because war crimes have always existed, since Cain and Abel's days. So every quarreling party, the war crimes, even in medieval times, even before, everything that is aggression against another population that you could consider as a war crime. But war crimes, as we know them today, and the legislation that speaks about war crimes originates from the kind of more awareness and it comes from the establishment of the nation state, right? So we don't have tribes here and there quarreling. We don't have feudal knights and lords fighting one another. It comes to a point where we have nation states, but nation states also quarrel. And the idea of this legislation started truly in form after the devastation caused by World War II in particular. Obviously, there were precedents, and there had been efforts, especially within the period that we call modernity, to try to align human behavior, even at war, with the rationality that at the time was felt was what distinguished humans from animals or so on. So the kind of incipient and efforts and sort of preparatory works were happening already, but it's not until the end of World War II and the devastation it caused, not only in Europe, but the repercussions it had in the world, across the globe, that nations came together and said, okay, let's regulate this issue. So the first instrument, the UN Charter, so the creation of the UN, the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and various other instruments that then became conventions, like the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Convention on ECOSOC rights, and so on. So in particular, in terms of crimes of war and the regulation of war, it is necessary to move on to speaking to all the regime that we know as international humanitarian law, which is contained in the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their additional protocols. So that was kind of the main, first sort of global effort to bring everyone to agree with some minimum principles of how hostilities ought to be conducted.
Okay, that's fascinating. And then can you tell us, we've also heard a lot of media reports about crimes against humanity. Can you just give us some background on what they are exactly, and then outline maybe the differences between crimes against humanity and war crimes?
Right. So going back to the regulation on war crimes, so we have all these protocols. The first protocol, and I need to go back because I need to set up kind of the context in terms of the legislation. So the first convention that was adopted was the protection of the wounded and the sick. And this was aimed at, as I said, trying to bring humanity into war, right? And it also provided for the protection of medical personnel, medical equipment, medical units, transport, and so on. There had been an attempt to regulate this in the Geneva Conventions of 1864, 1906, 1929. But it was here when this protocol was, and it was, okay, we have a war, we are against one another, but there is a minimum of humanity that we must respect here. Right. To that was added the second protocol, which applies those same principles to hostilities conducted at sea. And so it applies to hospital ships, crafts, also religious, medical, hospital personnel that has to do with those hostilities that are conducted at sea. A third, the third Geneva Convention applies to prisoners of war. And I think you have a question for me later on regarding prisoners of war. And it was, again, to protect, to raise the standards of how they ought to be treated, but no defining who were the people that were protected. And this category guarantees certain conditions of confinement, certain conditions of their captivity, the access to judicial proceedings, and so on. And finally, the fourth protocol is the one that applies to civilians during hostilities, because the three previous or the three first protocols, which had precedents in the past, I mean, the prisoners of war had a precedent in the Principles of War Convention of 1929. And it was basically trying to bring all this legislation together and set up a framework to say, okay, we haven't been able to overcome war, clearly, but going forward, we're going to do certain things. So we're going to define the crime of aggression, and we're going to tell people how they're going to conduct hostilities from now on. So that has evolved because obviously you have all these instruments. At the same time, we had a proliferation of international instruments that were promoting and protecting human rights. But this, when you have quarreling nations, who is there to prosecute, to punish, to investigate crimes that are occurring or violations to those international standards? So the creation, I mean, for instance, the first court that was created to this effect was the Nuremberg Tribunal. And that's at the precedent for what today is the International Criminal Court. So the difference between war crimes are crimes committed at war, but in breach of those standards that have been adopted in terms of how to conduct hostilities. But when the International Criminal Court comes in, it defines certain crimes as those of her jurisdiction, and then new definitions come, and war crimes become or come to be defined as grave breaches of those Geneva Conventions, the four instruments that I just mentioned to you, which are the protection of the conduct of hostilities, the protection of the wounded and sick in land conflict, the one at sea, the treatment of prisoners of war, and the protection of civilians. Right. So war crimes include things like willful killing, torture, or inhuman treatment, and that includes biological experiments. And learning from what happened in World War II, you could see why this was deemed to be necessary. Willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, extensive destruction and appropriation of property, which is not justified by military necessity, and that is carried out unlawfully and wantonly, right? Compelling prisoners of war to serve in the forces of hostile powers, or willfully depriving prisoners or protected persons of a fair and regular trial. Another war crime would be the taking of hostages, unlawful deportation of persons, unlawful confinement, and there are certain violations of the laws of the international of this framework that regulates or aims to regulate international armed conflict, like direct attacks against civilian population, civilian objects, humanitarian bodies, personnel, equipment, for instance, bombarding villages, what else? For instance, historic monuments, things that are not, I mean, if you're going to think, okay, what is the war for? Do you really need to destroy a hospital, a maternity hospital? Not really. If you're going to conduct hostilities, does it advance the purposes of your armed crusade, if you wish, to destroy ancient monuments, script? It doesn't. So it's trying to protect those things in which the whole humanity has an interest, but also trying to regulate certain conducts against those who are combatants and those who are not. Now, these crimes, as defined by the Rome Statute, which is on which the International Criminal Court is founded, are those who are affected against the civilian population. Now, there is a different category, which is the crimes against humanity. Obviously, these categories overlap, but it's called a crime of humanity when this type of attack is widespread or is systematic and is directed against the civilian population. And that includes murder, extermination, torture, slavery, and so on. So sometimes they overlap, but they can be distinguished in legal terms for the effects of prosecution, investigation, so on, and punishment. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much for that. That's a very thorough explanation. I believe we have a question on social media for you.
Well, a couple actually. So, well, the first one I think you've just answered, and that's really about the distinction between what gets classified as a genocide and what gets classified as a crime against humanity. Is one.
Actually, you are divine. I'm sorry to interrupt, but genocide is it's a different category as well.
Okay, interesting. Right. So that's the first
genocide.
Question.
Yeah. So genocide has a particular feature, and should I answer it now or should I wait?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so in genocide, basically, genus, you're talking about a group of people, right? So there has to be an element that characterizes the members of a particular group. Say, for instance, the Rohingya or the Jews or the Roma populations during Second World War, or I hesitate, but Palestinians. Once you pick up on a group for a particular feature of this group, be it because they're part of a national group or an ethnic group or a religious group, then you call this genocide.
Okay, that makes sense.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. Yes, it's a crime against an entire group.
Yes,
yeah,
and
okay.
It is a crime aimed not simply to attack the identity of the people, for instance, but more to do with actual extermination. So it covers things like killing members of the group or causing them serious harm, mental or physical. For instance, inflicting on the group conditions of life that will aim or have as an effect their physical destruction. For instance, population control, like it used to happen with indigenous communities in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Peru, with Fujimori, that went through forced sterilization, the groups of indigenous women that were put through forced sterilization. All of that counts as a genocide, because it's trying to finish, exterminate the group and prevent it from procreating, for continuing. Another crime of genocide is, for instance, what happened with indigenous populations when members of the group children are taken and transferred to be raised by a different group. So the practical effect is that this group as such starts ceasing to be. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So the other question, this is an interesting one, thinking from the point of view of somebody who is accused of war crimes and is possibly on trial. How far does the defense go of just following orders? Where does that fit in?
How far the defense go on?
Of just following orders.
So
how
far does that work as a defense?
A valid defense.
The defense is not a defense.
Okay.
It's just not a defense, because you cannot be forced to commit a violation or a breach, a grave violation of international humanitarian law standards. You can't say, well, he told me to kill everyone, so I just did it. No. And combatants that are on trial or want to be put on trial can say, for not executing the order, can take that as an exception, right? They can say, well, I didn't comply with my order, because the thing is, we're talking about military organizations. They're quite hierarchical. It's top to bottom orders. It's a line of command, and you have to follow the authority. But again, international human rights law comes in to say, and international humanitarian law in particular, to say, no, this is no excuse. You can stop, and you cannot be prosecuted for that, in theory.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's great. So obviously all that discussion then leads me on to the next question, is that do you believe, based on the evidence that we've seen coming out of Ukraine, that crimes against humanity and war crimes are being committed there?
Well, can I break that question into three parts? So you asked me, do you believe? This is not a matter of belief. This is a matter of a rational application of standards and law. So I would have to have the evidence in front of me to say, is this happening or not? Now, the evidence, it depends who you're asking what the evidence is, because if you're asking someone that's listening to this being a campaign for the defense of a territory, or people who are presenting, for instance, in Colombia, we had a massive scandal, which was called false positive scandal. I don't know if you're aware of that, but it was a program by the government, by coming directly from Casa de Nariño, which is the presidential palace, to say, we need to increase the number of that combatant in order to tell people, to show that we're winning the war, right? But, you know, in a very classic story, you know, broken hair sort of fashion, very Scottish. What happens when you don't have those bodies to bolster up your numbers? Well, you create them. So what they did, and there's evidence of this, is members of the army would put out ads announcing job opportunities. They would target young men in deprived communities with these offers of work, only for these men to be transported in a military truck to provinces where there was active hostility. There were active hostilities taking place. They could do 30 hours travel, and as soon as they arrived into the location, they would be shot, dressed in guerrillas uniforms, and then be accounted for as combatants. So I'm gonna be to the side, but it depends on the evidence, who is presenting it, and what are people saying. And are crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine? I have no doubt that if we have two parties or one party exerting hostilities, and you see that civilian non-combatant population is being deliberately targeted, there are crimes against humanity being committed. Now, my solidarity, of course, I hope it goes without saying, is with the people that are suffering this horrible war. But we must not forget that there are wars happening elsewhere. The distinctive feature is that, of course, this one involves two nation states, right, which are big players, but also one superpower, which is Russia. And it's taking up all of our attention. But remember, this idea of crimes against humanity, war crimes, these also apply to internal armed conflict, and what was I going to say? Internal armed conflict, whether the combatants are regular soldiers or not, whether they are recognized parties or not, whether legal or illegal parties, if you wish. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much for clarifying that. I do believe there are lawyers in Ukraine collecting evidence at the moment as we speak. But just moving on then to the next question, do you think, are there laws about how POWs are treated? Because obviously there are interviews being broadcast from Russians and Ukrainian POWs. Obviously there's a blogger, I think Ukrainian, who's conducting interviews with Russian POWs, and is that a breach of any particular legislation?
Interviewing them, or what's happening to them?
Actually interviewing the Russian POWs.
Interviewing them, well, again, it's the complexities of what's happened with war. I mean, we have rules, and we want things to be conducted in a way, but people don't follow rules, less so at war. In principle, there's nothing that will prevent an interview. What should not be happening is either a prisoner of war who is obliged to disclose sensitive information, or being forced to tell a different story of how he came to be a prisoner of war, or the things he's seen from his experiences in conflict.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
I mean, people, even combatants, have to be treated with respect. I mean, for instance, a prisoner of war cannot be forced to, say, fight for the party who holds it. At the same time, well, using a person to make propaganda doesn't quite sit with what the idea of how to respect the dignity of a prisoner of war works.
Okay, that's great. And can you explain the role of the International Criminal Court? And I noticed that Ukraine hasn't actually signed up to the Rome Statute. So can you just very quickly, if you don't mind, just explain what your universal jurisdiction is?
Okay, so universal jurisdiction is a kind of development from the idea of extraterritoriality of criminal law. So basically, when the nation states, we have to keep going back to these foundational concepts. So when the nation states were created, part of keeping the boundaries of a state meant one power and legislation that applies to that place. So it applies to the citizens of the place, to the acts that have happened to the place. And for instance, if you look at criminal law provisions, civil law provisions, usually what they deal with is crimes that happen, for instance, we're in Scotland. So crimes that happen in Scotland, either by a Scottish citizen or to a Scottish person, and they tend to be tried here or against Scottish or property located in Scotland, say. But there is a figure of criminal law, which is extraterritoriality of the law, which allows, for instance, for someone who has caused harm to say I'm a state and some of my citizens are elsewhere and they have been harmed. So I can somehow extend the arm of my criminal law and say, right, I want to bring those people who harmed my citizens, bring them and try them here. Now, what this universal jurisdiction does is bring it even a level, one level up, even more. And is to say, well, those crimes are not committed in my soil, because territory is one of the foundational, again, concepts that goes associated with the creation of the nation state. It's not been committed over my territory. It has not been against my citizens, and it has not been done by any of my, it's not against my citizens, and not done by any of my citizens. But it's saying, because these crimes, because the object of protection, I mean, and the harmed individual isn't really to humanity, then what's happening, nation states are trying, perpetrators that have committed atrocities, crimes against humanity, genocide, or acts of against the rules of against crimes against humanity, war crimes, and so on, bring them into the territories or try them, because, for instance, the domestic courts won't do them, or because for some reason a prosecution could not be raised in a different in an international forum, like the International Criminal Court, for instance.
Okay, so maybe the rules of the International Criminal Court then could be extended to Ukraine. Okay.
It's not so much the rules of the International Criminal Court as much as the rules of I mean, it's an interesting modern development. I mean, crimes used to be prosecuted mostly and very rarely on the basis of what's happening in a territory. And extradition agreements, for instance, have to do with that. But this one is saying, no, it doesn't matter what it was actually committed. It doesn't matter who committed it or against whom it was committed. this meaning is with my territory or my powers. But it's like the breach, it offends humanity. And so a national court sort of takes upon themselves to make these persecutions according to international law standards.
Okay, I see. Sorry, apologies. We'll just see if there's any more questions coming in from social media.
Yeah, so we've got a couple on a similar theme, which is really about how this stuff works in a modern world. So what you think the limitations of this current set of laws might be. So for example, one, thinking about technology. So obviously we're in a world now where we have semi-autonomous weapons like drones, pilotless drones, at some point may become fully autonomous, but then may be used to target civilians, for example. So how can we think about those kind of situations? Or other situations where you might target a group of people that aren't necessarily well defined in terms of ethnicity or nationality, because populations become more mixed, essentially. Does that mean that the definition of genocide becomes harder to police?
Could you break that question into two? Because it's two different parts and it was too long. So could you, let's go to the first part. Would you tell me, would you repeat the first part of the question, basically?
Well, it's really about the role of technology. So just think about situations where it's where it becomes very difficult to say who is responsible for a military action, for example. You know, if systems become more and more autonomous, then it can be quite difficult to actually point the finger at any one human being. Yes,
absolutely. It diffuses responsibility. But that's another thing that's happening with the complexity of even ordinary crimes. And by that, I mean crimes that don't have a political angle, but crimes, for instance, drugs, human trafficking. These are becoming harder and harder to prosecute because of the way they are performed. There's how to say, there are various layers, and it's very difficult to pinpoint who gave the order. There should be means in which this loophole should be covered. And basically, I'm sort of giving you away my PhD hypothesis. But basically, yes, it's the way in which warfare and even ordinary crimes are performed nowadays have evolved. Yeah, and have evolved because now we have different technologies, different ways of communicating. So people can be associated in two completely different countries, and all they need to do is make a mobile call. All they need to do is press a button, and it dehumanizes conflict. It makes it difficult to apportion responsibility, attribute responsibility. And perhaps the challenge is to start thinking, how can we build resistance or respond to this change in the way these things are being done in order that we can make those responsible accountable, right? Now, there is another debate, is why are we so obsessed with the idea of punishment? But I suppose justice, this is something I have not resolved, but this is something that really takes up a lot of my thinking time, and is the idea of justice. We see it as a very noble thing. I mean, I breathe that, I live of that. Every day I'm in court. But I remember watching a video, and some of you will be familiar, of an experiment that was done with monkeys, in which monkeys were praised for completing certain tasks by receiving grapes. Apparently, they're very, very partial. This group of monkeys are very partial to the taste of grapes, and they really, really like it. And then they don't like cucumbers. Cucumbers are just not that good, not that tasty. So what researchers were trying to demonstrate, the experiment was to make the monkeys do the same and reward them. But then for doing the same, some were getting grapes and some were getting cucumbers. And what they realized is monkeys didn't like it. So when they saw that they were doing exactly the same as the others were rewarded, but they were not, then they would throw all this vegetable at the researchers. So maybe the need for justice, equality, and to punish those who wrong us is not this novel idea, but it's actually quite visceral, quite intrinsic to what we are as humans, but also in this very animalistic part. You know, maybe something inside our brains, who knows?
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Sorry, does that answer the question?
Well, it's yeah, I think so, as much as you can, I think. I mean, it's a massive challenge. Obviously, it's a massive, very complex, fast-moving area. So
yeah, but yeah, certainly signification makes the attribution of individual responsibility much more difficult. At the same time, why are we not bringing the makers of this technology into the court? I mean, they've participated. Then we get into the whole debate that is fundamental to criminal prosecution, and is where they were done voluntarily, deliberately, you know, were they done willingly or recklessly? But that's why we don't prosecute insane people or people with diminished responsibility or children, although in Britain we do, which by the way, everyone, it's wrong. Sorry.
yeah.
No, that's absolutely
Thank
fine.
you.
I'm just conscious of time. Well, but it's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you, and thanks so much for your explanations of those kind of concepts. But it looks like you haven't had a chance to get home yet, so I think we'll probably have to let you go now and get yourself home.
Did I get that boring so quickly?
No. No, it's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much for talking to us this evening.
Okay, but before I go, there was a second part to Paul's question.
Oh, sure, yeah, if you want to answer that, yeah. I think it was about the drones.
The drones, yeah, that's the one we just kind of addressed very tangentially, but there was something else, Paul, in your question.
Oh, the question about genocide, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just aware of running out of time. But really, as you know, to cut it short, essentially it was about, is genocide easier to police if you've got very well-defined populations? And is it harder to police if you have a kind of really well mixed population where it's more difficult to say who's actually being targeted here? And is that the future in which it becomes very hard to say who is actually being targeted here, because it's just a mix of cultures and mix of ethnicities and religions and belief systems and everything?
Yes, unless you would be able to find a thread that joins those people together as a particular distinguishing feature that would set them apart from different communities, different nationalities, different ethnicities, etc. Yeah, it would be harder to police in a way, but let me think. I'm going to propose something. What if a perpetrator decides that he's going to kill a particular group, say the group of Gogos, just to say anything, and he thinks these people are Gogos, but it turns out they're Gagas? Is he committing genocide or not?
Okay.
So do you define it by the victim group, or by the eyes of the perpetrator? I mean, as it is in the Rome statute, genocide would be, we're looking at the group. But when you look at hate crime, if you were able to sort of magnify that, multiply that, then we're looking at the eye of the perpetrator.
Okay.
Oh, I think you're a bloody foreigner, and it turns out that that you aren't. I don't know. I'm sorry, I said a swear word. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Good to go.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for talking to us this evening. It's been really interesting.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, I wish we could carry on, over a beer at the pub, but thank you very much for the
Someday.
invitation.
Okay, thanks. Bye.